This is Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Let's get into it. All right, guys, we've got a special guest on the podcast today. His name is Rod Dreher. He is a conservative writer, editor, producer, and documentarian. And he's a guy I've been wanting to get on the show for a long time. I was going back through my emails, and I think I first reached out to him in like 2022 or 2023. Just so glad we can get this done. But he has a new book and an Angel Studios documentary series out called Live Not by Lies. And so the interesting thing about this guy is he's done so much work, so much writing in the conservative space, but it's almost like Live Not by Lies is a bit of his magnum opus, because this is where he talks about totalitarianism and specifically how Christians can respond to the predations of totalitarianism. And that's essentially what the last half of the podcast is. But in the first half of the podcast, we were just talking, I'm just kind of looking at my notes here. You know, he lives in Hungary. Why does he live in Hungary as an American, and what people say about Viktor Orban in Hungary and some of the Eastern Bloc countries versus what people are actually experiencing that are living there. And really just the mass immigration, a mass migration of Muslims into European countries, how Europe in a way has been lost. Europe has fallen. They have not required assimilation for the people that are migrating into their countries. They're allowing Islamist ideologies to basically get deep roots in some of their areas, and they're doing so in a very, very naive way. And so we weaved in and out of a lot of subject matters there. And I mean, when you talk about stuff like that, guys, it can get kind of prickly. And he and I, we disagree on most of this stuff. But again, these are very, very important topics that you're not really going to hear most pastors talk about on Sunday morning from the pulpit. So you're going to get it from podcasters like me and authors like Rod, because that's essentially the world that we have to live in. We have to prepare people for a looming battle, and that could be a literal or a figurative battle, and conversations like this are going to help with that. So, guys, without further ado, let's get into it. Rod Dreher, welcome to Undaunted.Life, a man's podcast.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you're here, quote unquote, but you're not here as in like the United States of America. I heard a rumor that you live across the pond, as it were. And so what in the world are you doing over there, Rod?
I do. I live in Budapest in Hungary, in Central Europe. I moved over here a few years ago, in part because when I was working on my book, Live Not by Lies, I got really interested in the post-communist countries of Europe and how they were rebuilding their societies after dictatorship. And I like the people here, and it was an opportunity to live in Europe and experience that. Plus, I get to learn a lot being here in this particular country. It's governed by a nationalist conservative party, Fidesz, led by Viktor Orban, who I think is a real visionary leader. And I got to tell you, Kyle, when I first came here on a fellowship, journalism fellowship in 2021, I was here about 3 weeks, and I thought, wait, is this the same country that the American media has been telling me is just this abyss of fascist authoritarianism? It feels like an American Midwestern city circa 1995, but with better architecture. Because you don't have, like, this is the high holy month of Pride, right? Get on a train and go 2.5 hours to Vienna. You come out of the station, rainbow flags everywhere. They don't have them here. And it's not like whatever the New York Times might say. It's not like they persecute gay people. I see gay people walking on the streets every day here in the capital. But it's a country that is culturally conservative. And it also has a very strict policy about immigration. And so when we get people who come over here from Western Europe, like from Paris or from London or major cities in Europe, they get here and they've also been propagandized by their own media to think this is a horrible place full of brown shirt Nazis. After about a day or two, they're like, this feels like what Europe was like 30 years ago before mass migration. And in fact, I don't want to go on too long about Hungary, but this is important. I have a friend here, a young woman who's a journalist from Paris. Now, Paris is my favorite European city. She moved here 2 years ago, and I said, I'm glad you're here. We all love Budapest, but come on, Paris is Paris. She said, Rod, here in Budapest, I can walk out in the day or even at night, do my business, and nobody bothers me. In Paris, every single day, I was sexually harassed by migrants. I'd rather live here where I can be safe than in my home city where the police won't protect me. You get a lot of that over here. And so it's a really interesting place to try to understand the politics of Europe and the geopolitics of our own time.
Okay, there's so much there, and it's in an interesting twist. About an hour ago, this is coming out later, but about an hour ago, I posted on Instagram. It's a cartoon of an LGBTQ person, so purple hair, nose rings, rainbow shirt, and all that, and they're hugging a Muslim man. And the LGBTQ person is saying, essentially, we're so glad to have you. And the Muslim person is saying, I'm so glad you're so naive. And
Yeah.
so the thing is obviously things can get very prickly very quickly when you get into any of the 3 or 4 subjects that we've already brought up just in our first salvo back and forth. But yes, I've been reliably informed by dorks on the internet and in the mainstream media that Viktor Orban is basically Hitler, right? Because if it's a politician you don't like, they're Hitler, right? Obviously.
Sure.
And so that he's Hitler, he's leading a fascistic state. You can't operate normally. But it's literally people of the left will accuse the right of the things that they are doing. That's kind of a thing that they do, that they're known for. And it's the ultimate, it's not a derivative of gaslighting, it's the ultimate form of gaslighting. And so for you're living there. It's interesting because I live technically in the Midwest, even though Oklahoma is kind of like a place without a region. We're not the South, we're not the Midwest, we're just kind of like floating out there. But it's the grit of the people in this area of the country that makes me love them so much, right? And it's the same thing with Eastern Bloc countries, is there's a certain level of grit that these people are almost like infused with. And so I guess my struggle is as an American, as a Westerner, as a conservative, as a capital C Christian, above all of those things, how are we to look at some of these countries and live not by lies? We'll get there in a second, but how are we to look at some of those countries, especially whenever they're painted in such a negative light by our own media?
Yeah, man. I'll tell you what, that is a great question. And I have set myself out there whenever I do interviews for the mainstream American media and even the European media as a defender of Hungary. I mean, I'm an American, right? But I know from my practical lived everyday experience that for all of its problems, I mean, Hungary's not paradise, no country is. This country is so much more free than the countries of Western Europe. In Britain, for example, they're putting people in prison for tweeting things that are critical of Palestinians or Muslims. The guy, just as you and I are talking just the other day, an atheist from Kurdistan just got convicted in a British court of I forget what the crime was, but he burned a Quran in front of the Turkish embassy as a form of protest. Now, I don't think burning a Quran is the right thing to do, but it's free speech. And yet, that you can't do that here in Hungary. I'll give you an example. There's this guy, Peter Boghossian. He's a left-wing atheist who was a philosophy professor at Portland State, super woke college in Oregon. He reached out to me before he first came to Hungary 2 or 3 years ago to say, look, we have mutual friends. I've been offered a fellowship at a college there. I'm inclined to take it because this place is miserable, the super woke Portland State. But, I've heard all these things about Hungary. I said, Peter, you're going to come over here and you're going to find people who are basically conservative. And, there may not be big churchgoers, but they have a lot of respect for religion. So they're going to debate you, but they're going to welcome you because they're like we used to be in America 20 years ago. They're going to disagree with you, but they're just going to want to know, well, tell us what it's like for you. Tell us why you believe what you believe. So he comes over here, and I met him after he was here a month before I got back here. He said, man, you were completely right. I love it here. I can actually talk to people in the college who don't agree with me, but don't think I'm Hitler because I don't agree with them. That's the experience of Hungary. And all I can tell your listeners and your viewers is don't believe what the media say. If you can, come over here yourself. You will feel so safe here, and you can enjoy talking to people who are normal in the way a lot of Europeans in Western Europe just aren't anymore because they've been propagandized and they've been driven so hard by migrant crime.
Well, we're going to get to live not by lies here in a second, but to put a finer point on some of the things that we're talking about, because you brought up the mass migration. And typically when we're talking about mass migration, we're talking about people from third world and or Muslim countries that are going into European countries, into major cities, and doing nothing to assimilate to the culture, right? Because like here in America, I am pro legal immigration, and primarily I am pro people that are going to go with the American way of life, except for the standard American diet. You can leave that. Yeah, you bring your diet with you. But yeah, like learn the language, be part of the customs of this country. Don't hate things like baseball or apple pie or freedom. Like, just be a part of what we've done to assimilate to this culture. But these are people that are moving to London and they're carving out their own Islamic sects and regions, right?
Sure.
And they're basically using Sharia law to supersede the laws of London or the local municipality or something like that, because they know that the local magistrates are way too feckless and weak to push against them. It's kind of the same thing. Like if you burn a Bible in front of my church, the only thing I'm worried about is it catching a grass fire. That's it. That's the only thing I'm worried about. Like it's not really going to bother me. Like it's going to be an opportunity for me to share the gospel with you because you obviously have some anger that's leading to arson. But they would never, that same person would never burn a Quran. That same person would never say, oh, hey, the Prophet Muhammad was a pedophile and a horrible murderer, right? They're not going to say things like that because, that's just anathema. But when I try not to be hyperbolic, Rod, because I have some extreme opinions that I can defend to the death, but it seems to me that Europe has already fallen. It just hasn't fallen yet. It's just kind of like an inevitability. And again, when you say Europe, you're including Hungary and the UK all at the same time. So I get that it's kind of a blanket statement. But because of the mass migration and because the get along to go along attitude and kind of the left-wing authoritarianism, you got these green policies like in Germany that have made the energy less reliable, more expensive, and less clean. Like it seems like for a myriad of reasons, migration being the top of which, Europe is going to be no more, perhaps within a generation. What would you say to that?
Yeah, man, I hate to agree with you there, but it's a very serious problem. Lately, I've been following the work of this guy, Professor David Betts. He's at King's College London in the War Studies Department. And his academic specialty is civil war. And he's been saying for a few months now that Europe, Western Europe, and including the UK, is on the verge of a civil war. Now, he doesn't mean the standard civil war, like two uniform armies facing off against each other. He's talking about something more like bombings, disruptions, fighting on the street, et cetera, kind of like Northern Ireland was for many years. And the reason is, he says, because all of the social facts in these countries line up with what academic studies say is a pre-Civil War environment. Most of all, the migration, unlike in the United States, where we have a pretty decent way of assimilating people. It's not perfect, but it has worked a million times better than in Europe because of the thing you just mentioned, the ghettoization of Muslims and foreign communities, plus the fact that peoples in Europe, not only the elites, but all the way down, they have been so traumatized by the experience of the Second World War and Nazism that they're afraid to defend themselves. The Germans are the worst, but this is generally true. And they feel that somehow if they speak out against this, that they will be fascist. And they'll certainly be called fascist by the media and by academia and so forth. So they've just succumbed to this. And they've also been educated for 2, maybe 3 generations into hating the West, and feeling that the only thing that there is to be said about Western civilization is it was all bad. It was all racist, imperialist, and all of that. So they don't feel that they have anything left to defend. And Hungary is not like that. And that's one of the reasons I really admire Viktor Orban. And Eastern Europe, the former communist countries, most of them are not like that. But Orban is a real fighter. And they're like, no. We love what we have. And we know we're going to lose it if we keep allowing this mass migration. And he's also said, and Orban is a Calvinist, he said that the basis of European civilization is Christianity. That's it. And we're not going to survive unless we re-Christianize. Now, I have to tell you that Hungary is not a country where people go to church a lot, but there's so much, they're not hostile to religion in the way you see in France, for example, or in Germany. So I think Hungary has a chance, but the only way the rest of Western Europe has a chance is if it becomes more like Hungary.
Hey guys, real quick. I know a lot of you guys are really doing everything you can to have a consistent workout routine, but the problem is you work out at a Globo gym. And so there's 17 guys on the bench that you need, and there's people doing bicep curls on the squat rack. And the biggest problem is not your schedule. It's actually where you're trying to get your work in. How about you guys stop making excuses and build yourself a home gym? And when you do, make sure you use Sorinex. So Sorinex is a family-owned and operated business that builds some of the most impressive workout facilities in the entire world. They built gyms for teams in the NFL, MLB, NBA, NHL, and even the UFC. They've also built gyms for some of the biggest and most successful collegiate and high school athletic programs in the country. But in addition to that, they make the highest quality home gym products that I've ever seen on the market. In my personal home gym, I have the Sorinex Outfitter Rack, the heavy version in military green. Also, I have some of their center mass bells. I've got their Nordic glute ham developer and their patented landmine attached to my rack. So guys, stop fighting the riffraff at your local gym or bench or squat rack or whatever. And if you're going to build out a home gym, you may as well get one that will last you and one that you could even pass down to your kids. Begin your build out by going to Sorinex.com. That is Sorinex.com, Sorinex.com. Take control of where and when you work out, Sorinex.com. Okay, let's pull in the thread just a little bit more. As you were saying that, I literally wrote down in my notes, Crusaders. So one of my favorite books that I've read in recent years is by Raymond Ibrahim. It's called Defenders of the West, the Christian Heroes That Stood Up Against Islam. And you just hear, because again, there's a lot of revisionist history as it pertains to the Crusades, and it usually just depends on whatever the point the person's trying to make in whatever article they're writing for whatever left-wing rag. They like to kind of rejigger the different things. But the Crusades from the Christian side was a defensive battle because of the predations and the expansion of the Islamic state, I guess you could say, at that time. And so when you have Richard the Lionheart and you've got Godfrey and Baldwin and all these different heroes of the Crusades, you read these stories, and by no means am I saying that the people that fought for the Christian side were acting in a Christ-like manner at all times, because that's just how that works. It's war, it's nasty. People do things that they shouldn't do and that they don't live up to a Christ-like ethic. However, this was an ultimately defensive war that we took offensively as Christians to basically keep Europe from being completely Islamic. But now we're basically, you're basically getting your communities and your cities and your countries and perhaps even your continent overtaken by people with just a whimper, right? And it's kind of this thing. When I talked to Eric Metaxas, he gave me some words around this, but it's people that love to leave powder for tomorrow's battle, when tomorrow's battle may never come, because the war may end today, and here we are saving our powder. And it just seems like, is it because we're just too nice? We don't want to be seen as racist or xenophobic or Islamophobic or something like that. So when, cities in Michigan here in the United States are basically Islamic cities, when there's communities in Dallas, in the DFW area, that have been entirely ran by Chinese people that have immigrated here or Muslims that have immigrated here, again, it's not like we just eradicate those people, round them up and hang them, like nobody's suggesting that, but it's like, no, we have to push back on these ideas that aren't even vaguely in agreement with a Christian ethic, no?
No, that's right. And many people don't know in our country, in the United States, that Islam spread by the sword. It spread by conquest, the conquest of Jerusalem. It spread across North Africa, wiped out Christian communities wherever they found them, and invaded Spain and controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula for a very long time, until a Christian army led by Charles Martel, a Frenchman in the Middle Ages, defeated the Muslim armies as they tried to invade France. And then eventually, after hundreds of years, the Spanish Christians reconquered their peninsula. But this is completely not talked about. And Europe was threatened for most of its existence by Muslim armies, chiefly of the Ottoman Empire. Here in Budapest, where I live, Hungary was on the front line of these battles. It was occupied by the Ottoman Turks, Muslims, for 150 years. And you can still see evidence of this. For example, in Budapest, one thing all the Hungarians love to do is go to the natural spring baths. I mean, you have lots of warm water that comes out of the hills, and they go sit there. It's an ordinary thing for people to do. Working class people just go sit in the warm bath. My favorite one is just across the river from where I live. It was built by the Ottomans. You can sit in this octagonal bath and imagine the Sultan and his people sitting there and all the Hungarians that follow that. My point simply is, and I've heard Viktor Orban say this, he's like, we were occupied by these people for 150 years before we finally were able to drive them away. Western Europe has no idea what they're dealing with here. And this is why Orban is so hard on this issue, because he said, once they take over, how are you going to get them out? It's really hard to do. And I think, too, that you're right about we have to be nice. I think that there's such a tendency, especially in church culture, to everybody's got to get along. You've got to be tolerant. I think tolerance is a fine thing, but you've got to draw the line somewhere. Believe me, these Muslims who are coming in to Europe, at least, they have no intention of being tolerant. They have no intention of integrating. In fact, the Prime Minister of Turkey, Erdogan, he's an Islamist and democratically elected. He told the Turks who live in Germany, there are a whole lot of Turks there. They originally came as workers after the war. He told them, don't assimilate. You are the vanguard for the Islamization of this country. I mean, they say it openly, but the leadership elites, not just the political elites, but also in media, academia, and so forth, they don't want to hear it. They have this narrative in their mind that everybody can all just get along, diversity is our strength, and all that. And these outsiders to our civilization, not just Muslims, but especially Muslims, are just laughing at us.
It's a naivety that basically makes people soft-headed because they think they're being soft-hearted, but they're actually being soft-headed because when people, like I remember after the October 7th attacks, there were people that were twisting themselves into pretzels trying to figure out a way to make the Hamas charter not say and not mean what it says.
What it says, is like, it's there.
We are here with the express purpose of eradicating every Jew on the planet, and if we get a shot at America, we're going to take them out too. And then leftists here in this country or across the world will be like, oh, that's so precious. It's almost like if you've got an aggressive little kid and you apologize to the other parents that are on the aggressive little kid's wrestling team because sometimes he gets a little out over his skis at wrestling practice, gets a little bit too aggressive. Oh, I'm just sorry about little Timmy. He can get a little aggressive sometimes. It's like, no, Timmy's out for blood. He's trying to kill all the other kids. That's the situation that we're talking about. And it's like our brain, it's something like from Live Not by Lies. I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but it was something in terms of abortion where someone was like, no, I'm not saying what you're saying is not true. It's just I can't believe it. It's like they can't find a plausibility structure inside their brain that would allow them to believe that there's a group of people that it doesn't matter how many pairs of Levi jeans we give them, how many meals we bring to them in armored trucks, or how many opportunities we give their women to drive and to work. They don't care. They want our heads to be on the ground, separated from our bodies.
They live by a different set of rules. I was in New York on 9/11. I was a columnist at the New York Post on that day. I saw the South Tower fall with my own eyes. And I remember the trauma of all that. In the aftermath, I went in my Brooklyn neighborhood to a mosque that was a Muslim Brotherhood mosque where Al-Qaeda had done some recruiting. I went to their bookstore, bought books in English that were incredibly radical. They were still selling them. And I remember in those days, right after the attack, President Bush was talking about Islam means peace and all that. Right. You saw a lot of propaganda. And look, I get it. We didn't want to blame ordinary, decent Muslims because they're not all radical like that. But, they were trying to tamp things down. But at the same time, they were telling lies about what Islam is. And I remember, too, though, Kyle, in the year 2002, in the march up to the Iraq War, I'd moved over to National Review magazine. I believed anything that the government said that would justify a war. Now, I remember you had conservatives like Pat Buchanan, who normally I would listen to. He was saying, this is a bad idea. These people in Iraq, not only did they not have anything to do with 9/11, but we can't turn them into liberal Democrats in the sense that we're all liberal, right-wing liberal. You can't do it. It took many centuries and a lot of blood in the West to get what we have today. You can't expect people who believe in this religion, which is incompatible with democracy, and they're also very, very tribal. So we're going to spend a lot of blood and treasure, and it's not going to work out. I didn't want to hear any of that because I still believed back then, that over 20 years ago, that deep down, everybody wants the same thing in life. Everybody wants to be free. No. It's a lie, and it was a very costly lie. We turned Iraq into a vassal state of Iran, and look at Afghanistan. The Taliban are back in charge now. I remember talking to my brother-in-law who won a medal for his service in Iraq. He was just straight up working class guy from Louisiana, listened to Rush Limbaugh, all of it. When he came back, he was really disillusioned. I said, so what do you think of the war? He said it was a waste. So I'm trying to learn from that and not believe the things that my government and the media want me to believe about the rest of the world, because I saw with my own eyes how they used the naivete of the American people to try to convince us to support a war, that it was a bad idea because we were never going to make these people liberal Democrats, right?
Well, and I think part of it, Rod, is, and you even said it just there, we've been conditioned to believe that there is a delineating point between Islam and radical Islam. But when you say something is radical, you're saying that it is an extreme, outer edges version of the real thing, right? But when you read the least abrogated surah of the Quran, which, the Quran's not in alphabetical order or in chronological order, or any of those types of things, the 9th surah is the last surah that we get from their supposed prophet, Muhammad. It is the most violent and most bloody and calls for the most violence. And so since it's the least abrogated, that means it supersedes all the peaceful verses that people will pull from the Quran to say that no, like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, these people are doing Islam incorrectly. It's all these other people that are more moderate that are doing it correctly. But literally, just like we talked about earlier, it's the exact opposite that is true. It's the moderate Muslims that are not doing what their prophet is saying that they should be doing. Because the same thing, it's easy to see radical Christianity because when you study the life of Jesus and the things that Jesus said to do and the standards by which Jesus laid out to morally live a godly life, as it were, if somebody were to kill somebody in the name of Christ, they would be doing a radical thing because it doesn't comport with or jive with what the text actually says, right? It's kind of what people say that, if a Christian does something badly, it's like if you go into Guitar Center and somebody's playing Sweet Child of Mine poorly, you don't blame that on Slash, right? That's not Slash's fault, right? That's the person playing the guitar. The problem with Islam is, no, it's simply not a religion of peace, and it was never meant to be that.
No, you're right about that. And I mean, it is true. I happen to know Muslims who do not agree with the terrorists. The problem is, as you say, they don't have a lot of ground to stand on historically or scripturally in terms of the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings, because it is what it is. And the radicals, so-called radicals within those communities, actually have a stronger basis within Islam itself to justify what they do. But I remember, though, it's so hard for us, Kyle. I remember back in 2002 when I was doing a lot of writing about it, I had a friend who was working in counterterrorism. And she said, be careful how you write about this, because a lot of our best sources are Muslims who are terrified of these people. And they can never go public because even living in the United States, they'll be killed, especially if they're immigrants. A lot of Muslim immigrants just disappear. Well, they've been killed. And she said, we have to be careful to tell the truth about Islam without demonizing all Muslims, because if these sources dry up, we're in trouble. It's a difficult thing, but I'll tell you, I moved down to Dallas after I was in New York and started working at the Dallas Morning News. And based on my experience in New York and all the things I learned about Islam, I saw a lot of Islamic radicalism in North Texas. I mean, this was like 20 years ago. And an FBI source told me that North Texas, at least at the time, was the second biggest place to do terror group fundraising behind the Washington, D.C. area. And a lot of it was because there were so many Muslim engineers there. Anyway, I just started writing things that I would find out publicly about the Dallas Central Mosque, which at the time was the largest mosque in Texas, things they were teaching. Man, the local Muslim community came at me, the activist community came at me really hard. But my editor, God bless her, she said, look, I'll be willing to take all of this on your behalf as long as you have your facts lined up. And I did. I always did. But the newsroom itself, I wrote about it in my column, but the newsroom wouldn't touch it because they were, in my judgment, they were so much more interested in being nice, and they were terrified that they might give some Bubba somewhere in the suburbs a negative thought about Muslims. We even had, Kyle, something that came out in the Holy Land Foundation trial. It was a Hamas fundraising front that pretended to be a charity. The FBI introduced into evidence a document they got in a raid on one of those houses. It was a Muslim Brotherhood planning document in which they said, our goal is to infiltrate the West, infiltrate it all, and undermine the infidels from within. In the trial, the defendants admitted, yeah, okay, that's real, but we don't believe that anymore. Well, guess what? 2 weeks ago here in Europe, a report leaked, a highly confidential report from the French government in which it was a for your eyes only for the top French officials, saying that the Muslim Brotherhood has built all these networks all over France with the same goal.
Right.
And, I mean, it's out there. It's reported. The French government said, yeah, this is real, but not much has happened. And I'll tell you this. You remember me telling you about David Betts saying that civil war is coming? Not long after that came out, I went to France to promote some of my books. And I would just meet Christians there, just ask them, ordinary people. So do you think civil war is coming? Dude, every single one of them didn't even hesitate. Oh, yeah, it's coming, because there is no way to reconcile this. And I think that you and I absolutely are going to live to see it. And it's going to be a horrible, horrible thing. But, the appeasers in government in the UK and France and Brussels all over, they're only going to be able to kick this can down the road for a certain amount of time before ordinary people have had it.
Yeah, I think history will look back on this time, and for all we know, history is going to be coming to a close soon. Lord, come quickly. But it's going to look back on this time and see this as, if you had to put it encapsulated into a single sentence, the ultimate Trojan horse that happened in Europe, perhaps in just the West at large, of these lies and these horrible satanic ideologies that were allowed to spread. And that really is our transition to talking about Live Not by Lies. And so Live Not by Lies is a book that you release, but also there's a 4-part docuseries with Angel Studios. And so I've watched the 4-part docuseries, guys. There's links in the show notes where you can buy the book. It's very highly rated and reviewed. And also I thought the Angel Studios docuseries was fantastic. But let's just talk basically. Let's fly over it, and then we'll kind of dig down a little bit. What's the difference between the book and the docuseries? Like, was that always the intention to do a book and a docuseries? How'd you get hooked up with Angel? Let's just start there.
Okay. Well, the book had its genesis in 2015. I was living in my hometown in South Louisiana at the time, writing for the American Conservative. And I got a call one day from a physician at the Mayo Clinic up in Minnesota. And we had a mutual friend. And he said, I got to tell somebody this. My elderly mother spent 6 years as a political prisoner in communist Czechoslovakia, because she was a Christian. She refused to stop going to church, and so they jailed her and tortured her. She came to America after she got out, and she lived here most of her life. He said that my mom is old now, lives with me and my wife, and she said, son, the things I'm seeing happen in this country now remind me of what happened when communism first came to power in my home country. And she was talking about, in particular, what was happening at the time around Memory's Pizza. Does that name ring a bell, Memory's Pizza?
Yep. It does.
Yeah. It was this evangelical-owned pizza parlor that had to shut down for a while because they got so many death threats because the owners said we would not cater a gay wedding. We'll serve gay customers, but we're not going to cater a gay wedding. That's what triggered her. I thought that's a little bit extreme. You know, my mom's old. She watches a lot of cable news and gets scared easily. But after that, I made a point whenever I would, in my travels, meet somebody who had come to America to escape communism, I would say, so what do you think about wokeness? That's what it was. Does it remind you of what you left behind? Dude, every one of them said yes. And they would get really mad because Americans don't take them seriously. So I ended up writing this book, Live Not by Lies, the first half of which explains the similarities between wokeness and what's happening in America and the similarities between communism in Russia and Eastern Europe, but also the differences, because there are some important differences. We don't have gulags in America. We don't live in an Orwellian state. So a lot of us think, well, this got to be crazy. We don't have totalitarianism here, but it's a softer, more insidious form that has the same effect. I published the book in 2020, in September of 2020, and I had the good fortune, if that's the right word to use, that it came out after the summer of George Floyd and the race riots and the way elites and corporations everywhere just suddenly went berserk about how with DEI, and also after COVID, which scared a hell of a lot of people about how fragile things were and what the government could do. The book ended up selling over 200,000 copies, almost all word of mouth, mostly from Christians, because the media completely ignored it. No surprise there. But the book gave people, not just Christians, but mostly Christians, a framework for understanding what was happening. Now, the book became such a sensation in the church community that I was approached by the filmmakers. They said, we want to do a documentary about this. This is the same team behind No Safe Spaces with Dennis Prager. And I contributed to it. They based it on my book. I'm interviewed for it, but it was a separate thing done by this really talented young filmmaker, also a Christian, Isaiah Smallman. And I would say that the main difference between the book and the movie is the book is filled with a lot more factual information, historical stuff to help people understand. The movie touches on that, but it also dwells on the stories, the incredible testimonies of Christians, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, who lived through it. And they talk about how their faith helped them stay strong and not surrender to the lies that their governments expected them to accept.
Well, and Rod, I think the thing that was very helpful for me watching the 4-part series is understanding, as you brought up there is a difference between hard totalitarianism and soft totalitarianism. The thing is in America, we don't learn about either, right? Mm-hmm. Why was I 30-something years old before I heard the name Alexander Solzhenitsyn or heard about the Gulag Archipelago? Why was that the first time? Why are there kids in America that are graduating from high school? They probably shouldn't be, but they're graduating from high school and they've never learned about the Holocaust. Right? They certainly aren't learning about Mao's China. They're not learning about Pol Pot's Cambodia. They're not learning about like any of these other people. They're not learning about Stalin. They're not learning about Lenin. They're not learning about any of these things. And so when they hear ideas that were propagated by those types of folks, they're hearing it for the first time and It sounds good. It is like sugar-covered diarrhea. Like they love it, but all they taste is the sugar. Well, but go ahead, Rod.
You there?
Yeah, we're there.
Yeah,
sorry, we had
we
had a little bit of a snafu. Let me actually tee it up this way. Anytime you do something, because people think, oh gosh, how are we going to end this? Right? So they've got a book or a poem or they're doing a mini documentary or whatever. It's like, how are we going to end it? We got to end it. But they forget about the concept of primacy and recency. Yes, we remember the thing we most recently saw, which is the ending, but we also remember the beginning. And we've all seen those movies that had a great beginning and a terrible ending or vice versa. But y'all made a very interesting decision to where you start out episode 1 of this docuseries with a video of the director of the UK March for Life. Her name's Isabel von Spruce, I think is how her name is pronounced, being arrested in the United Kingdom because she was silently praying on a public sidewalk across from an abortion clinic in the UK. She was arrested for that. And so the image is an indelible image for me as a pro-lifer and as a person that, goes and teaches churches how to push back on pro-life or on pro-abortion arguments, rather. Why start there when you could have started basically anywhere in the world of totalitarianism?
Yeah, I think because it's so unbelievably shocking to, and should be shocking to, contemporary audiences, primarily American, because the movie was made with an American audience in mind, though we're having a premiere in London next month. But to see that this has happened to England, which is our mother country, right, where liberal democracy was born, to see that it is impossible there to pray silently on the street. She was arrested for the thoughts in her head. And and we just happen to have, thanks to Alliance Defending Freedom, the Christian NGO, the legal NGO that defends Christians, they had a camera there recording it. And you just can't believe it. It's so shocking to people today. This happens in England because it's not in our media. In fact, Kyle, I was interviewed a couple months ago by a London-based reporter for the Wall Street Journal, an American guy. He is the guy that readers of the Wall Street Journal, one of our biggest papers, depend on to tell them what's happening in the UK. Well, he got in touch with me for a story he's writing about the growing alienation from MAGA to Europe. And I brought up Isabel Vaughan Spruce. I said, we're seeing on social media these sort of things, these persecutions happening in Europe, and this matters to us. And he said, wait, who's that? I'm like, wait, you don't know Isabel Vaughan Spruce? No, I don't think he was a bad guy. I think, and I told him this, I said, you are paying so much attention to the other media in England, which do not want to report this stuff. Yeah. So we wanted to hit our viewers of the movie with actual evidence of an arrest for the thoughts in your head happening in a free country, supposedly free country. And we wanted people also to know that this is something that hits real people. They have to pay a real price for it. Isabel says in the documentary, she said, in her country, she said, I would understand why if people would say like, oh, that can't be happening because it sounds so crazy. It is happening. And in fact, they've gone on in England since the Southport killings, where the son of some immigrants from Africa murdered 3 little girls. The British government is now throwing people in prison for sending out tweets criticizing that. I mean, it's insane, but it's real. And, you mentioned earlier that we haven't been taught about what totalitarianism was. In the book, I talked about this 26-year-old young woman I met. I know her family. She was raised in a conservative church-going family, but she had moved to California. And she told me, I'm a communist. I'm like, what? Why? She said, well, I believe that the equality of all, peace, et cetera, et cetera. She goes, I think it's a good thing. And I said, okay, but what about the gulags? The what? She had no idea. And she had been raised in a conservative church-going family. And her lack of historical knowledge left her completely vulnerable to these lies. And that's a big part of it.
Yeah, soft-hearted and soft-headed again. So I want to talk about the abortion and trans issue, but let's go back to the issue of lies, because that's really like a theme throughout the entire series and the book. Is in order for these things to be taken, we don't take them wholesale, but we have to be forced lies. There have to be lies that are forced down our throats. That's essentially what we have to do, because that's what propagates totalitarianism, is the belief in lies. If you can convince people, let's just wrap it all up. So the abortion and the trans issue, because if I can convince you that there's no difference between male and female, or that you can switch willy-nilly back and forth based only on how you feel at the moment, I can literally convince you of anything. As Jordan Peterson has talked about in his work, like there's no more standard fact than sexual dimorphism in the mammalian species, male and female. There's no more fundamental fact that we can believe. Now, obviously, as Christians, we believe there are things that are even more fundamental than that. But just speaking from a strictly biological standpoint here on this planet, he's right. If you can convince people that you can switch teams, you can be convinced of anything. And so is it almost like they're shooting for the stars immediately. Like, let's not worry about these small lies that will eventually lead to somebody believing that you can change your gender. Let's just start there, because if we can get them to believe that, we can get them with anything we want.
That's exactly right. Because it is one of the most undeniable facts in observed reality, men and women. And yet they were able, they meaning like the government, the media, academia, and so forth, they were able to compel people to live by this lie, because you could lose your job, you could lose your business, you could not get into universities, things like that, unless you accepted the lie. And there is a line by this man, Czesław Miłosz. He was a Polish anti-communist dissident. He wrote a book called The Captive Mind. It came out in the 50s after he left Poland. And he was trying to explain how intelligent people will accept all this garbage. And he made a really interesting point. He said, a lot of people in the West think that we only accepted it because the gun was held to our head by the Soviets. That was part of it, but not the whole of it. He went on to say that there is something inside every person that is desperate for a sense of harmony and a sense that, we can live in peace. And if you have totalitarians, activists like the trans people saying, if you want to live in peace, if you want to protect your job, if you want to still be respected in the community, if you want your kids to love you and not kill themselves, then you better accept it. And that's where it comes in. And this is also why, Kyle, in the book and in the movie, you hear these Christians from all over the former communist world talk about the willingness to suffer for the truth. That is at the core of it. Whether it's suffering like being sent to prison and maybe losing your life, or simple suffering like being abandoned by all your friends. People are so afraid of that they will go along with just about anything. This woman, I don't know what you think about this part of the film. I think it's one of the most powerful. This woman, Kamila Bendova, she's still alive. She lives in Prague. She and her late husband, Václav, were the only Christians in the inner circle of the anti-communist movement in that country. It's a really atheistic country. And I asked her, I said, Kamila, was it hard for you and your husband as Christians and as political conservatives to be in a coalition with these hippies and these people who weren't believers to fight communism? And she said, Rod, no, it was easy, because when you're standing up all alone in against totalitarianism, you will find that so many of your fellow Christians will keep their heads down just like everybody else was doing. These hippies, we may not have agreed with their atheism or their lifestyle, but they had courage. They knew that this was wrong, what was happening to our country. My husband and I, as Christians, knew that we were accountable to God, not to our friends and neighbors. And so we also knew that we had to stand with them, because they would look after our children if we were sent to prison, and they knew they would look after, we would look after theirs. So the point I want to make, Kyle, is that courage and the willingness to suffer is so key. I remember standing in Moscow, just off a Red Square. I'd interviewed this man. We couldn't get him for the documentary because we couldn't travel in Russia. But he's in the book. Yuri Sipko, he's a retired Baptist pastor. He used to lead the Russian Baptist community. He looked at me, pointed his finger at my eye and said, go back to America and tell the church that if you're not prepared to really suffer for your faith, you're lost. And that's really true.
Rod, I had this discussion with my wife within the last year, because, we're growing in prominence here on Undaunted.Life. My voice is growing in prominence, those types of things. And I was like, babe, because of the things that I believe, which are basically a biblical ethic as it pertains to morality, sexuality, like all those different things. And this was before Trump was elected, so obviously there's a different feel in this country right now. But with the thought of Kamala Harris becoming president and the continuation of that regime, it's like, babe, there might be a time coming where I'm going to be in handcuffs because of the things that I say on this show, or because we decide to go to church or any of those types of things. And if you don't think it can happen here, it just happened in Canada during COVID and different things like that, obviously. And we spoke to some of those guys here, James Coates on the show, and other folks that were put in prison for basically holding church. And I think part of it, Rod, is we live in perhaps the time in history with the most ubiquity of the Bible. and the least biblical literacy. So especially here in the States, like you have people that have 6 or 7 Bibles on the shelf that all have, a quarter inch of dust on them. And we've got 5 or 6 Bible apps on our phones that we just don't open, right? We get a new phone and we don't even like download the Bible app because we don't ever open it anyway. We don't read it, much less study it. And if you even do a cursory study of the Bible, you don't come away with this idea that as a follower of Christ, things are just going to be, Bentleys and rainbows and unicorns, right? Like
that's exactly right.
Some of the biggest heroes of the faith died horrific deaths because of the faith. I mean, just look at the apostles. John's the only one that got out somewhat clean, and they actually tried to boil him alive. It just didn't work, right? And so like the others, they were skinned alive. They were crucified upside down and all these horrible things. And so that's part of the thing is, as American Christians, we've bought the lie that being a Christian means things are easy and things are okay, derivatives of prosperity gospel and whatnot. Sure. But it's like, no, we're not ready for the fight, and we don't want to get ready for the fight because we're soft in basically any way you can be soft.
Yeah, we don't want it to come to us. But as Solzhenitsyn said, there is this thought in the West that what happened in Russia can't happen here. He said, believe me, what happened in Russia could happen in any country in the world under the right circumstances. And I dedicated the book, Live Not by Lies, to the memory of this very brave Catholic priest. I'm not a Catholic, but this man is a real hero of mine. His name is Father Tomislav Kolakovic. He escaped from Zagreb, Croatia in 1943. He was doing underground work against the Nazis, and they were coming for him. So he escaped and went to live in his mother's home country, Czechoslovakia. And under an assumed name, he started teaching at the local Catholic college. And when he got there, he told his students, I have good news and bad news. The good news is the Germans are going to lose this war. The bad news is when it's over, the Soviets are going to be running this country. And the first thing they're going to do is persecute the church. We have to get ready for it. So what he did was speaking to his students who wanted to listen to him, he prepared them biblically in terms of discipleship and also in terms of learning things like how to survive an interrogation, practical things they needed for the underground church. Within 2 years of his arrival in that country, they had a little Kolakovic group in every town of any size in the Slovak part of the country. Now, he had to fight against some of his bishops, some religious leaders who are like, Father, come on, it's not going to happen here. You're just scaring people. You're alarming them for no reason. But he kept doing his work because that man, when he was preparing for the priesthood, he wanted to be a missionary to the Soviet Union. So he had to learn the communist mindset. Well, it all happened, like he said, because he had done what he did and because enough Christians, a minority of them, but enough of them had taken him seriously and prepared themselves, the underground church in the Slovak part of Czechoslovakia was strong.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite people that you discussed in the docuseries. And it really goes back to a theme, you could call it an overall theme of the docuseries, is that in order for totalitarianism to work totally, Christians need to accept their persecution and marginalization and refuse to fight back. And again, it's this pacifistic strain of Christianity that gets this idea that Jesus was just this wispy-haired, Danish-looking guy that just constantly walked around and told people he agreed with them, and it doesn't matter how you live your life. It's this, hey, come as you are thing. Well, guys, guess what? If Jesus loves you just the way that you are, then he didn't need to die on the cross for your sin debt. So that's kind of like a package deal. But yes, I think it just kind of goes back to this idea that Christians have accepted their position in this country as being downstream from culture. And so what do Christian artists try to do? They try to look like culture. What do Christian pastors try to do when they're trying to build another campus or try to, expand their influence or sell more books or get a bigger Instagram or whatever? They try to just do the things that culture is doing, and they just sprinkle some Christian over the top of it. I talk about these not men's ministries, but these big ministries that it's basically TED Talks with Bible verses sprinkled over the top so they can keep their tax exempt status, right? And the songs aren't really prickly at all, and none of the sermons are really going to go at things like sin or immorality, because they just want you to get some life lessons and make you feel good, get you your spiritual Skittles, and then get you back there next week, right?
Be a good middle class nice guy,
right? The problem is I think, because I talk to people that are part of the underground church in Ukraine, it's like, are the people, we mentioned Dallas several times, are the people in the DFW area, the Christians there, are they ready to be a part of the underground church? Because it's fine. They go to church, a couple of times a month, and when it doesn't, conflict with a travel baseball schedule or the lake or things like that. But they're Christians, right? Because grandmama was a Christian, and they listen to country music, and they occasionally vote, and when they do, they vote Republican, and God's pro, all those things. But if we're in a situation like the countries you describe in the documentary, or in Ukraine, or say like a Nigeria, where Christians are being beheaded by Boko Haram in droves, being just gunned down in their villages. Gosh, I just don't think we have the stomach for it. And maybe that's the burning off that would need to happen, to where it's only whenever the church is in the persecuted state when it seems to be at its strongest, because you only get people that actually have real faith.
Yeah, the Danish Christian philosopher Soren Kierkegaard from the 19th century, Protestant guy, radical Protestant, actually, he ended up falling out with the state Lutheran church. He made a really interesting observation. He said that a lot of people admired Jesus. What a great guy. Look at him and look at how compassionate he was, et cetera, et cetera. But Jesus didn't call admirers, said Kierkegaard. Jesus called disciples. And you can tell the difference between an admirer and a disciple when it comes time to really suffer for the faith. Whether it's a matter of martyrdom, which is the most extreme form of suffering, which has happened throughout the entire history of the church and is happening today, as you said, in Nigeria and in Egypt, or whether it's simply not being invited to be part of the social group because Christians are weird and you believe bigoted things or whatever. If you're not willing to accept that because, for the sake of the gospel, then you're useless. You're just an admirer of Christ. And I think that describes most American Christians, whatever your denomination. Something you said reminded me. Back during COVID, I'm a convert to Eastern Orthodox Christianity, part of the Orthodox Church in America. I was living in Baton Rouge then, and we had a small mission church. We suddenly started seeing an influx of young men and young couples to our church. And most of them had come from mega churches. We're like, hey, we're happy to have you here, but what brought you here? And it was all a variation of the same story. COVID shook them up so much and made them realize, hey, life can change very radically, very fast. We don't feel that our previous church is preparing us deeply enough for persecution. And this church seems like it's a more serious, deeper form of Christianity. And this same thing has been happening to Orthodox churches all over the U.S. I don't know the Protestant world that well, but in Catholic churches, you're seeing a lot of young people, especially young men, go to the older Latin Mass simply because it's serious and it demands something of you. The church is not there to make you feel good. I mean, it's not there to make you feel bad either, but, it's like we're here to be disciples, not admirers. And we're not here for therapy. We're here to change, to convert, to become holy. And you can't do that just by changing your mind. You have to change your life. This is what these people in Eastern Europe who were persecuted by the communists, this is what they found out with a gun to their head.
Well, Rod, if you're a Christian, you're at war, but we don't act like it. And so here's the thing. Several times throughout my life, because I'm kind of a lunatic, I work out like crazy, and I don't just work out for fun. I work out like... People have asked me a lot. They're like, hey, why do you work out so hard? I'm like, well, partially because I'm just working out for life. I want to have longevity. But one of my sons one day is going to say to a kid on the playground, hey, my dad can beat up your dad. And it's my job to make sure my kid's not lying, right? But I remember this guy, he came and worked out with me on a Sunday night. And gosh, he was dying, right? He was on death's door. And afterwards, he came up to me and he was like, Kyle, I don't understand. I work out 3 or 4 days a week. Like I work out hard, but for whatever reason, your workout just killed me. I was like, what did you do? The elliptical or something? It's like you were working out. Yes, categorically binary, 0 or 1. Yes, you checked the box, you were working out, but you weren't working out hard. And so you have these American Christians that are checking the box. They're going to church, right? They are in a community group or a life group or whatever they're calling it, right? They go to random action word church, and then they're thinking they're being prepared for war. But you don't prepare warriors by just having them drink milk, right?
Right.
You give them meat and you give them tasks, right? And you give them standards. And that's why I've talked about a lot, young men being drawn to Eastern Orthodox and to traditional Catholicism, like the Catholic Mass and different things like that, is because there's a strength in it. There's lead in the pencil, if you will, to where they go to some of these Protestant churches, and it's like it's this doughy, frumpy pastor or this pastor that's trying too hard to be relevant and to be stylistic or stylish, but they're not giving me anything that's going to prepare me for battle.
That's true. And look, it's mostly true about the American Catholic Church. I was Catholic for 13 years. I haven't had enough experience broadly in the American Orthodox Church, but I would not be the least bit surprised if some of the older congregations, which were more concerned with, for example, being Greek than being Christian, that if they would be soft and conformist in the same way. But this new generation, the Gen Z and younger millennials who are finding their way to the more rigorous traditional forms of Christianity, they want to be challenged, especially young men. In the Orthodox Church, fasting is a regular part of our Christian discipleship. And when you worship with your body. You're not just sitting there hearing a lecture, you worship with your body. And, it's masculine without being macho, if that makes any sense. And I'm really drawn to it. I can see whenever I go back to visit churches of some of my Protestant friends or some of my Catholic friends, even if they are in conservative churches, you still get that sort of therapeutic idea that you're just there to hear something uplifting and then go on your way. And that can be fine if you're in a time of peace and prosperity, but we're not in that time, and it's going to get much, much worse before it gets better. And I'll tell you this too, Kyle. A few years ago, I was in France promoting one of my books, and I met with this French intellectual, one of the top intellectuals in his country. He's a Jewish atheist, had been on the left, but has been pushed to the right by Islam and the decadence in French society. And so we talked, we shared a lot of the same views about the decline of our civilization. Finally, I said, Professor, where do you find hope? And he looked at me and said, I have no hope. He was serious. I said, I do have hope, and my hope is in Jesus Christ. But please don't think I'm saying that to you in some trite, kitschy way like a TV evangelist. I don't believe things are going to turn around anytime soon. But because I believe in Christ, that any suffering that I and others have to do out of fidelity to him will be redeemed. I might not live to see it, but it's going to be redeemed. Suffering in Christ, if you unite yourself to the suffering of our Lord, it will be redeemed. Now, that man listened to me very respectfully and said, well, that's good for you Americans, but here in France, we don't believe in God. Cal, I had nothing else to say to him because he was clearly in so much despair over what's happened to his country. Well, I'm going tomorrow after we talk. I'm going to France. I'm writing a story about a pilgrimage that the traditionalist young Catholics, are all young, make. It's a 3-day walking pilgrimage, 40 miles from Paris to Chartres, to the old medieval cathedral. These are young people who don't want to give up. They don't want to shrug and say, we have no hope. Their hope is in Christ. And get this, they're having to do this. It's a Latin Mass community. They're having to do this with the opposition of a lot of their bishops who just want to go along to get along. And but the spark is there, man, and it is rising. And thank you for what you're doing to help it rise in the Protestant community and any Catholics or Orthodox who listen to you.
Yeah, absolutely. We're happy to have all you. I know for a fact that we have Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox, and atheists in this audience, and we're thrilled to have all of you. And I think part of what you're talking about, Rod, with that gentleman is identity. He found his identity in the colloquial understanding of his community, which is we're atheistic. We don't believe in sky daddies, right? We've risen above that. We're too smart for that, right? And so it's like, but again, he who shall not be named, Ravi Zacharias taught me about origin, meaning, morality, destiny, right? Every single worldview has to answer those 4 questions. Origin, where did everything come from? Meaning, why is anything, including you, here? Morality, what's the difference between good and evil and how can we tell? Destiny, what happens to you when you die? Well, if you have a nihilistic point of view or an atheistic point of view or a Buddhist point of view or something like that, you have to answer those 4 questions. I just happen to believe that the Christian answer to those questions is a lot more plausible than I am a highly evolved chimp that used to be a fish, that used to be goo, that used to be stardust, and all that stardust came into existence in a timeless, spaceless, immaterial beginning. Sorry, I just don't really buy any of that. But Rod, we got to wind to a close a little bit here. So, you might listen to a conversation like this and be like, well, gosh, this is really depressing. This is, there's not really a whole lot to go on here. But again, if you're a follower of Christ, you know that we ultimately win in the end. But what is your final message to the people in my audience about, okay, yes, there is this information that's in the docuseries, that's in the book. It's not fun. It's not cute, and it's not clean. But what is your ultimate message to people about where we are now and where we're going?
Yeah, the ultimate message is this. We do live under a form of totalitarianism. It's not like what George Orwell, it's not like Russia. It's more like what you can read in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. It's a totalitarianism that is based on comfort, on making people so comfortable and so afraid of losing their comfort that they will surrender their liberties and maybe even surrender their faith to preserve their sense of comfort and harmony with the post-Christian society. We as Christians have to understand that, and we have to prepare ourselves and our children and our communities right now to resist it, to resist its manifestations that are happening right now and anything that might come in the future to get much worse. Because I can't do better than that dear old Russian Baptist pastor, Yuri Sipko. If you're not prepared to suffer for the truth, to suffer for Jesus Christ, you're going to capitulate. These people in the film, Kyle, not a single one of these Christians we interviewed thought he or she would live to see the end of communism. But God intervened. The reason I bring that up is because they were willing to suffer persecution, the hatred of others, for the sake of the Lord and for the sake of truth, not expecting any earthly reward, but realizing that they were accountable in the end to God Almighty. That's the message I want to get to your listeners, and to take the lesson from Father Kolakovich. He was told, don't scare people, don't make them think things are going to be bad, but he knew the truth. And the people who believed him, like the people who may have believed Noah, that a flood is coming, they survived. Many of those who didn't take it seriously, who thought everything's going to be great, it can't happen here, they went under.
Well, Rod, I appreciate everything that you've done, and I appreciate your work, but that's all for me. Is there anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, if people want to read me writing every day, I write a daily Substack about politics, culture, religion, roddreher.substack.com, and go to angel.com and stream Live Not by Lies, the movie. Your kids, it's so important for youth groups and young people to see this. They might never pick up the book, but they'll watch this movie because it's a compelling movie full of human stories. And it's so inspiring. I know this story left and right, up and down, backwards and forwards. And still, in the fourth episode, when that guy, Timo Krischke, the young artist, talks about suffering and hope, I cry because I know what that meant to those people. And I know these are the witnesses that God has sent us to our time to prick our consciences and wake us up.
Absolutely, guys. It is all in the show notes. Rod, I appreciate it again.
Thanks so much, Kyle.
There you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed my time with Rod. But before we let you go, we are going to do a quick resilience boost. At Undaunted Life, our mission is equipping men to push back darkness with content that forges spiritual, mental, and physical resilience. The links I've got for you today. I've got a link to the Angel Studios website where you can watch Live Not by Lies. Also a link to Amazon where you can buy the book version of it, and a link directly to Rod's Substack. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Wherever you're listening to this, please subscribe, rate, and leave us a positive 5-star review. If you want me to come speak live at your event or on your podcast, just shoot me an email to info@Undaunted.Life. That's info@Undaunted.Life. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook, and check out our website for everything else, including how to donate to keep more content like this coming your way. Just go to www.Undaunted.Life. And as always, we want to thank the band Holy Name for allowing us to use their music for our content. The music on this podcast is their song Perpetua, which is off their self-titled debut album on Face Down Records. The links are in the description. I'm your host, Kyle Thompson. Remember, keep pushing back darkness, keep forging spiritual, mental, and physical resilience, keep seeking the Lion of Judah.